All right, so we jumping into The Corpse Collector. This is a documentary. This is The Mystery Abyss. So let's jump right into it.
August 9th, 1987. A dense heat fills the air of Philadelphia, a storm on the verge of breaking. Harrison Graham, a mentally impaired 28-year-old, known to local children as the eccentric man who carries a Cookie Monster puppet around with him everywhere he goes, holding conversations with it using a creepy impersonation of the character's distinct voice, is evicted from his small apartment in a dilapidated row house. After neighbors complained of the horrific smell coming from his apartment, Harrison had refused his landlord access to find out what was going on, resulting in his eviction. As his landlord's son and nephew arrive to carry out the eviction, Harrison nails a door shut in the apartment, before fleeing down the fire escape with a handful of clothes, a bottle of water, and his beloved Cookie Monster puppet. Unable to enter the apartment to find out what was causing the unbearable smell, the police are contacted to break the door down and investigate. Local police were already on high alert, having recently discovered and arrested a brutal serial killer, Gary Heidnik, living only a few miles away from the address.
Dang, what's up with the area? They got a bunch of just serial killers running around. They're all having a meeting.
Simultaneously, the investigation into the brutal and unsolved case of the Frankfurt Slasher, a serial killer who had been hunting in the exact same area of Philadelphia, was in full swing, which you can learn more about in my deep dive into the case linked below. I highly recommend watching that video first if you haven't done yet, as it will provide some interesting context and background that will add a lot to this video. Harrison had previously been seen digging graves he claimed were for dogs, and was known to hang around with drug dealers and users. But despite this, and despite his weird and eccentric ways, no one suspected he was harboring the dark and twisted secret that he was. Because Harrison was a serial killer.
Like nobody
and the smell his neighbors had complained about was actually coming from the many rotten corpses hidden in his apartment. This is the shocking story of...
That's crazy. When people be having that smell or them dead bodies, like, they don't get tired of that smell. That smell ain't, it don't irritate them. Like, that's crazy. You just live in a place where, I don't know, I couldn't do it. Like,
Officer Pete Scalatino was well acquainted with the neighborhood where Harrison lived. A neighborhood of tenements that were mostly boarded up, abandoned, and in total disrepair. While it might not have looked like the sort of place anyone would live, this desolate neighborhood was home to those on the fringes of society. Drug addicts, the homeless, the desperate. Police were frequently called to the area to deal with drug dealers, pimps, and cases of domestic violence. Arriving at 1631 North 19th Street, Officer Scalatino found the front door to the building was broken open and covered in rubble, with windows shattered throughout the hallways inside. Making his way up to the third floor, he was instantly struck by the unmistakable stench of death, exacerbated by the hot and humid weather. It was a smell he was all too familiar with, and he had no doubt he was about to find a body. With no working electricity, and most of the windows boarded up, Officer Scalatino struggled to see what he was looking at as he approached Harrison's dark apartment at the end of the hallway. As he entered, he was shocked to find waist-high piles of trash in the darkness, with food containers, rotting newspapers, and piles of dirty clothes and dried feces scattered throughout the room. On the wall, a disturbing drawing of a naked woman was defaced with crude, abusive language, smeared with what appeared to be dried blood. Approaching the room that had been boarded shut, Officer Scalatino was sure the cause of the foul odor lay behind it. The name Marty was carved into the door, with an open keyhole beneath it. Scalatino tried and failed to open it, causing him to kneel down and peer into the keyhole. Through the opening, he saw what looked to be the legs of a black woman, lying unnaturally still. Was she the source of the stench? After knocking and trying to get her attention with no response, Scalatino called for backup and was quickly joined by Charles Johnson, an investigator with the medical examiner's office. Together, Officer Scalatino and Investigator Johnson forced open the door, breaking through the nailed boards. As soon as it swung open, they were struck by such a strong and overpowering smell that they struggled not to instantly vomit. Like the rest of the apartment, the room was completely covered with trash. Lying on a mattress on the floor, now fully visible, there was no doubt that the woman seen through the keyhole was dead. She was bloated and discolored from decomposition, with her limbs twisted and contorted. Next to the mattress, there lied another bloated female body on top of a pile of trash, dressed in a miniskirt and a shirt with the words "Pour toi" and a red rose on it. Officer Scalatino quickly set up yellow crime scene tape around the apartment and in the hallway as he called for backup, unsure exactly what he'd just discovered. Because drug overdoses were extremely common in the area, he knew it was possible that the two women had simply died and been left to decay. But something about the whole situation led him to believe this wasn't just another overdose case, that this wasn't just another decrepit drug den. He suspected he had stumbled upon something much, much worse. And unfortunately, his instincts were about to be proven right. Detective James Hansen, who had just wrapped up the Heidnik investigation, was sent to the scene to see what he made of it. Donning masks to protect themselves from the overwhelming filth, by 3:45 p.m., the detective and his team had discovered the remains of a third woman. Having been wrapped inside 2 sheets and buried beneath the trash under the second body, this woman was practically skeletal, with only a few fragments of her clothing left to potentially help identify her. The state of her remains strongly suggested that the grim happenings at 1631 North Street had been ongoing for quite some time. Needing space to move and photograph the 3 bodies, the team had no choice but to start clearing the mess, and were forced to start chucking furniture, clothing, and garbage out of the window. Less than 2 hours later, a 4th set of mummified remains was discovered, wrapped in sheets and buried beneath the rotten trash. Detective Hansen was quoted saying, "This is the first time, to my knowledge, that we found 4 bodies of suspicious death in the same house. It seemed to the detective that one room had been used by Harrison to live in, and the other room had been turned into some sort of private mausoleum." With 4 bodies now discovered in the small, cluttered apartment, and no doubts that this was not a simple overdose case, more officers, including the medical examiner Robert L. Catherman himself, were called in to help with the investigation. As thunder rumbled outside from the breaking storm, more lighting was brought in to allow the forensic team to sift through the endless piles of trash for any clues or evidence. By 5:30 p.m., a 5th body was discovered wedged between the 2 mattresses on the bed, where it had clearly been for a long time, having decomposed to the point where gender could no longer be determined. It appeared as though Harrison had been sleeping on the top mattress, with this decomposed corpse directly beneath him, like a dried flower pressed between the pages of a book. As more and more muck and debris was cleared, an officer called out after,
"How do you sleep on top of decomposed body? That's crazy. That is nasty as hell."
Discovering a 6th body crammed into a tiny 6-inch deep closet, wrapped in a sheet and bound with white electrical cord, buried beneath garbage and tattered clothing. Eventually, with the sun gone and rain falling, the already difficult search had become even more uncomfortable, and with 6 bodies found, the operation was suspended until morning. Despite the rain, rumors of the discovery of the bodies spread through the neighborhood, leading local residents and reporters to gather outside and watch as body bag after body bag was carried out of the building by officers wearing masks. With the bodies taken to the morgue to be properly examined, it seemed clear to the detectives that they had just stumbled across the graveyard of yet another serial killer. Despite living so close to Heidnik, it seemed unlikely that Harrison had anything to do with his similar murder spree. Yet investigators couldn't help but wonder if they'd just found the home of the Frankfurt slash.
Do you think they knew each other? That's a good question. Like, do you think they knew each other? It was into the same stuff, so who knows?
When the search resumed at dawn the next day, it expanded to outside the apartment, and it didn't take long for a 7th victim to be discovered. Unlike the other bodies, this one was found dismembered on the roof of the building, inside a decaying canvas bag hidden beneath a stained mattress. There was no head or torso with the remains, with locals telling them that Harrison had been seen digging in the backyard and on vacant lots across the street on numerous occasions. The team began preparing to dig in the hopes of locating more bodies. A photo of Harrison was printed in the local newspapers that morning, while patrol officers hit the streets in search of information. The manhunt for this disturbed serial killer had begun. A warrant for Harrison's arrest was quickly issued. Because detectives were yet to determine the cause of death of the decomposed bodies in his apartment, they charged him with multiple accounts of abusing a corpse. At the very least, they knew for a fact that Harrison had been living with the dead bodies in his apartment. Harrison, who liked to go by the name that had been found on the door to his tomb of horrors, Marty, had been living in the rundown building for more than 4 years, and was a familiar face in the neighborhood. In part due to his role as a handyman, with many reporting that he often seemed quiet and friendly. However, they also learned that he had a reputation for dealing drugs, and that his apartment was a known drug den where users went to shoot up. Speaking to one of his neighbors, They discovered that Harrison kept notebooks filled with crude drawings of naked women and dismembered body parts, including breasts, feet, heads, and male genitalia. The same neighbor even told them that they had once witnessed Harrison dangling a woman out of his window, causing her to scream before he quickly pulled her back inside. The detectives discovered that Harrison was known to frequent a few specific areas where he had friends and family, so assumed he may have fled to one of these locations. But their searches failed to find any sign of his presence. Police did manage to locate his mother, Lillian Graham Jeter, who was only 45, meaning that she had given birth to 28-year-old Harrison when she was just 17 years old. He was the oldest of 5 children. According to Lillian, she had had no choice but to kick him out of her home in 1979 due to his heavy drug use. However, she did share one important detail with them. A few months earlier, Harrison had told her that his girlfriend, Mary, was pregnant, before informing her that the baby had died sometime before July 4th when she saw him. She also informed them that he was classified as learning disabled, and that he had been diagnosed with a mental disorder at 12, leading to him being hospitalized for 2 years, and that he had spent time in foster care. Investigators were never able to confirm whether he had actually received an official diagnosis like she claimed. It became apparent that his developmental issues had made it difficult for him to form meaningful relationships in his youth, and by the time he reached adulthood, Harrison had developed a nasty crack cocaine addiction, which only exacerbated his troubles. After leaving his mother's house, he began drinking heavily and associating with pimps, sex workers, and drug dealers in the rough neighborhood he moved to. During this time, he acquired his prized possession, a Cookie Monster doll, which he became deeply attached to and took with him everywhere he went. Locals informed them that Harrison was often seen taking long walks with the puppet, which he would use to entertain neighborhood kids. While some saw this as harmless, others told the police that he seemed crazy, especially when he drank and could be seen doing things like dancing in the streets or talking to his puppet alone. Well,
He definitely has some going on. Like, no doubt about that. Something was definitely was wrong with them. Needed some help. Should have got some help. I don't see how the mom should have got him some help. You got to intervene with those things at a early stage, and hopefully things can change.
none of these neighbors reported seeing Harrison engage in any violent behavior, and he had no criminal record. It wouldn't be long before a number of women would emerge claiming that he had physically attacked and sexually assaulted them. In the morgue, the medical examiner's team began trying to identify the victims and to determine their causes of death. DNA science was still in its infancy at the time and was not commonly used to identify victims yet. The first 2 victims, both black women, appeared to have only been dead for a couple of days, with the intense summer heat causing them to rapidly decompose. Both were likely in their late 20s or early 30s, and neither initially showed any obvious signs of violence or trauma. The other bodies were in such bad states that their race and sex couldn't even be identified. As a result, an anthropologist was called to help analyze their bone structures. Eventually, they were able to confirm that 2 more of the bodies belonged to black women in their 20s, and that the remains found on the roof also belonged to a woman. Despite initially struggling to find a cause of death, a broken hyoid bone on the 4th victim was eventually discovered, implying that they had been strangled, and by August 11th, it was confirmed that the 2 most recent victims had also been strangled to death. Their times of death were also extended to have been sometime in the past 10 days. With at least 3 victims confirmed to have been murdered, there was now no doubt in anyone's mind that they were dealing with a serial killer, and that they needed to find Harrison quickly before he had the chance to hurt anyone else. The media reports about a madman on the loose kept the public engaged. After hearing about the discovery of the bodies on the news, a woman came forward stating that she believed her roommate Sandra Garvin, who had been missing for several months, might have been one of the victims. She had gone to buy drugs from Harrison, but had never returned. Before long, police learned the identities of 3 more women who were all known to have connections to Harrison and were all missing. 2 of these women were ultimately found alive, and as a result, they were removed from the list of potential victims and placed on the list of potential witnesses, with one of them having lived with Harrison without incident. Another neighbor reported to the police that she had witnessed Harrison beating a woman called Robin Deschazor, leading them to suspect that she could be one of the victims. Meanwhile, the husband of Mary Jeter Mathis contacted the police, recognizing the shirt found with the second body as one he had purchased for his wife. While tips on potential identities of the victims were pouring in, so were sightings of Harrison, thanks to his photo being shown on the news. On August 11th, there were sightings of him on Broad Street, riding a SEPTA bus, at a soup kitchen, and at a car wash. Although these sightings were all deemed credible, police failed to arrive in time to make an arrest at any of the locations. Another witness claimed to see Harrison getting a meal at the Cathedral of Deliverance Evangelistic Church, describing him as looking vacant and glassy-eyed. In this instance, police arrived at the scene moments after the sighting, confirming his identity with the picture to witnesses, yet once again he managed to evade them. Simultaneously, the building on North 19th Street where Harrison had lived was condemned due to multiple code violations, leading to all of the remaining tenants being forced to vacate. This made it slightly easier for the crime scene investigators, who were busy sifting.
Would you even want to stay in a building where it was a serial killer? I'm cool. I'm out. Yeah, I'm moving. You ain't got to tell me twice.
Through the piles of trash and debris inside Harrison's apartment to continue their search for evidence. Among the mess, they discovered 2 earrings near the mummified remains of the 3rd victim, and a ring and 3rd earring alongside one of the other bodies, both of which had distinctive designs. Police released details of the finds, hoping somebody might recognize them as belonging to somebody. In the hopes of helping confirm the identities of the victims, forensic dentist Haskell Askin was called in. Of the 6 complete sets of remains discovered, 5 of them had undergone some form of dental work, so Askin put out a plea to the public for anyone who feared their loved one may be among the victims to provide him with dental records for comparison. Meanwhile, investigators continued their search of the condemned building and its surroundings. The officers digging up the garden discovered more bones buried where Harrison had previously been seen digging. However, just as he had claimed, they turned out to belong to dogs. Struggling to locate Harrison, his mother and siblings issued a public plea for him to surrender himself to the police, though they did not believe he was responsible for the deaths. One of his younger brothers claimed he was so afraid of bodies he couldn't even attend their grandmother's funeral, so there was no way he could have been living and sleeping in a room with corpses. Then, 6 days after the initial discovery on August 15th, another chilling find was made. In the basement of a building a couple of doors down from Harrison's apartment, a human torso and skull were discovered wrapped in a brown blanket and tied with electrical cord. Given it clearly mirrored how the other bodies had been stored in Harrison's apartment, it was assumed this was yet another victim of his. However, these remains were found partially covered by a pile of coal ashes, suggesting that other remains had been burnt and left there too. Were they from the same victim, or did they belong to someone else entirely? The 7th victim discovered on the roof was missing these specific body parts, so it was also unclear if the remains belonged to the same person or an 8th, new victim. By the time these remains had been discovered, the medical examiner's office had been able to confirm that 6 of the victims were black women and had formally identified 36-year-old mother of 5 Mary Jeter Mathis, whose husband had recognized her clothing, as one of them. Then, 2 days later on August 17th, Harrison's mother Lillian received a call from her son that would change everything. Harrison, tired and hungry, asked if she could bring him some food, explaining that he wanted to meet with her. As they spoke, Lillian remarked, "Stop running, son. Whatever happened, we can work this out. Just come on home. We love you. Your family loves you." Miraculously, her words seemed to have an effect on him. She arranged to meet him on a street corner a few blocks from his apartment, where officers Ed Spangler and Larry Brzezicki arrived to take him into custody. By evening, Harrison was charged with 7 counts of abuse of a corpse and 7 counts of murder. Initially, Harrison told Detective Hansen and the investigators questioning him that the bodies had been in the apartment when he moved in 4 years ago, and that he hadn't killed anyone, despite evidence showing that at least 2 of the victims had been killed less than 10 days before he was
4
evicted.
years versus 10 days.
After hours of interrogation, however, with Detective Hansen pushing him relentlessly, Harrison's story changed. Initially, he admitted to having killed the 2 most recent victims. But by the next evening, he had changed his story and claimed that he had killed all 7 women, but that their deaths had occurred while he was high and having sex with them. Even more disturbingly, he claimed that while his hands had done the killing, he wasn't responsible. According to Harrison, it was Marty, a split personality he claimed was living inside of him. As he began opening up, he revealed that all of the victims had been killed that year, with the first murder occurring back in January. According to him, it just started happening, and once he had begun, he found that Marty was unable to stop. The first murder he described to them was of a former girlfriend, Robin Deschazor, with forensics confirming the remains on the roof and in the nearby basement belonging to her. He was quoted as saying, "She knew about Marty and his desires. I didn't want her looking at me that way, and I seen God being angry through her eyes." He admitted that after killing Robin, he was so shaken and terrified by what he had done that he left her body in his apartment. It wasn't until he brought another woman there that he tried to conceal the body by lifting it through the bedroom window onto the roof. He even claimed that he ended up telling a girlfriend about the body and even showed it to her. According to him, she threatened to report him to the police unless he got rid of it, resulting in him relocating her head and torso to the nearby building it was found in, leaving a handful of her remains in a hidden bag on the roof. According to Harrison, he lured all his victims, whether acquaintances or strangers, by offering them drugs. What began as consensual sex would always end in strangulation. Each time, Harrison said he was shocked when he woke up to find his victim dead beside him. Claiming to be remorseful for the crimes his split personality committed, he identified a number of the victims, and with the help of family members, 6 of the 7 victims were identified as Robin DeChazor, 29, Mary Jeter Mathis, 36, Sandra Garvin, 33, Cynthia Brooks, 27, Barbara Mahoney, 22, and Patricia Franklin, 24. Throughout the interrogation, Harrison sketched faces of his victims with surprising artistic skill. The detectives, who had expected the mentally disabled man to struggle to communicate, were actually surprised by just how talented and articulate he was. It even turned out he was not as illiterate as had been claimed and was an avid reader of the Bible. Ultimately, Harrison provided a 10-page confession letter that detailed every one of the murders. In it, he repeatedly insisted that the deaths were all accidents and that they had all died while being choked during sex. Despite Harrison having confessed to murdering 7 women, giving investigators in the ongoing Frankfurt slasher case reason to suspect his involvement, none of the victims had been stabbed or assaulted like those of the slasher. Furthermore, at the time, police were looking for a middle-aged white man in that case, not a relatively young, tall black man. So it didn't take long for them to view Harrison as a separate killer. Ironically, the same detectives would go on to accuse a different black man, Leonard Christopher, of being the slasher based on almost no evidence.
They always do that. They know they're looking for a white man, but they blame a black man. Make it make sense. This is something they are. Come on, man. Make it make sense.
Regardless, establishing Harrison as a different serial killer meant that at the exact same time he was committing his murders, Heidnik had been murdering women a couple of miles away from him, and the slasher had been killing in the same general area of Philadelphia. All 3 cases, as shocking as it seemed to detectives, appeared to be completely unrelated to one another. While being held without bail in solitary confinement, Harrison was appointed a public defender, Joel Moldovsky, to represent him. Moldovsky discovered that Harrison had been handcuffed to a chair for hours during his interrogation, and hadn't even realized he could request legal counsel, although his mother had been present during questioning. Moldovsky immediately questioned whether Harrison was capable of signing his confession, or if the confession, which could also serve as his death certificate, was lawful. While detectives insisted the confession was valid and procedurally sound, Moldovsky argued that Harrison's due process rights had been violated. On August 25th, an anonymous former girlfriend of Harrison's wrote an account in the Daily News, recalling that in January he had confessed to her that he had killed another girlfriend and thrown her out of the window. When Harrison was out, she went out onto the roof to discover a skeleton beneath an old, worn mattress. She claimed that when she finally left him a while later, she told the police about the body, but that they ignored her and didn't even go and check if she was telling the truth.
Damn.
She claimed to suffer from severe nightmares about Harrison's hands around her throat, considering herself lucky to have not been one of his victims.
She could have been next, but the police also could have
stopped. In trying to
stopped.
determine if there's any truth to Harrison's claims about having a split personality called Marty, it was important for the investigators to look further into his background. Using information he openly offered to them and what they were able to gather themselves, it seemed clear that he had had a difficult childhood. As a young boy, struggling to form relationships, he spent much of his time on the streets, where he claimed he finally felt deeply loved for the first time, and got himself entangled with a male pimp as both a lover and an employee. Introduced to prostitution, drugs, and what must have been a very confusing homosexual relationship at a young age, his mother was eventually able to pull him away from the streets. While it's not clear when Harrison transitioned into becoming a serial killer, some psychologists have claimed that the conflict between being a loving Christian son and a homosexual drug addict who embraced the darker side of street life could have created an internal division. If true, this division would then eventually manifest itself in the creation of a separate identity, Marty, who Harrison could blame for his actions, leaving him free from guilt, shame, or responsibility. That said, despite seeming to single Marty out as a darker personality in his initial comments, Harrison would later go on to claim that Marty was actually his good personality, the friendly handyman everybody knew and loved. Whereas, according to him, he had two other personalities. One was called Junior, and was a childlike, Christian heterosexual who loved his mother. And one was called Frank, who was a homosexual, streetwise drug addict, who was responsible for the murders. Supposedly, Frank viewed homosexuality and drug use as sinful, and held a strong hatred and resentment towards women. Unless I've misunderstood his varied statements made after his arrest and throughout his trial, it comes across to me that while Harrison clearly had mental troubles, the concept of genuine alternate personalities living inside of him was most likely made up as a means to try and evade punishment for his crimes. To try and identify the final known victim, detectives enlisted the help of forensic sculptor Frank Bender, who we've spoken about numerous times before, such as during his instrumental role in helping capture family annihilator John List. Bender was a renowned sculptor who frequently worked with law enforcement to create lifelike busts and age-progressed reconstructions of fugitives and victims, resulting in numerous cases being solved and victims being identified. The victim's distinctive elongated face, with a pointed chin and asymmetrical nose, made her stand out as an individual. Bender added a plausible hairstyle to his bust and took photographs for the newspapers, hoping someone would recognize her. An older couple came forward after seeing the image, believing it could be their 25-year-old daughter, Valerie Jameson, who had been missing for 6 months. Comparing her medical records to the remains, a unique rib feature was used to confirm her identity, alongside personal items found with the remains, including earrings identical to those she was known to wear. Detectives now knew the identities of all 7 of the victims. Harrison's pre-trial hearing began with a chilling account from detectives about their findings throughout the investigation. Harrison reportedly rocked back and forth in an agitated state as he listened to detectives discussing his crimes and directly quoting from his confession about how he murdered the 7 women and the disturbing things he did with their bodies. Harrison's defense attorney, Moldovsky, contrastingly drew on a number of experts to make the claim that he was not mentally competent to stand trial. One of these experts, psychologist Dr. Stanton, claimed that after evaluating Harrison, his IQ was determined to be 63, which is below the threshold for mental competence. Coupled with his severe substance abuse and addiction issues, he claimed that Harrison's mental state was severely impaired. According to Dr. Stanton, Harrison also suffered from hallucinations, psychosis, blackouts, and chronic paranoia. Another psychologist, Albert Levitt, testified that Harrison lacked fundamental academic skills such as reading, writing, math, and telling time. Despite this, Judge Edward McKell, relying on the detectives and the district attorney's expert Dr. Robert Sardoff, who all believed Harrison was competent and coherent during his interrogation and confession, declared that he was fit to stand trial. On October 6th, Harrison entered a not guilty plea. When questioned if he understood what was going on by the judge, he simply responded, "Nope." He even claimed he didn't know where he was and that he just wanted to go home. The assistant district attorney suggested that Harrison was pretending to be confused, and the judge, accepting the not guilty plea, echoed the idea, believing Harrison was making up the alternate personalities to try and absolve himself of responsibility for what he'd done. In contrast, his mother Lillian remained adamant that her son was incapable of committing the heinous acts he was accused of and had confessed to, arguing that even under the influence of drugs or alcohol, it was impossible for him to have hurt anyone, or to have lived surrounded by corpses. After 5 more court-appointed experts evaluated him, Harrison was once again deemed fit to stand trial, with them all finding him calm, alert, and cooperative. Though they did identify personality disorders, none of them believed these would make him incapable of standing trial. In early February, a 2-hour hearing took place to decide which pieces of the prosecution's evidence would be allowed. Over 100 graphic photos of the apartment were introduced as evidence. Upon seeing them, Harrison dismissed them as the actions of a very sick person, and was even seen chuckling at the images. Charles Johnson, the medical examiner's investigator, took the stand and described the discovery of each of the 7 bodies. He presented the photographs as slides on poster boards, with Judge Robert Latrone even stepping down from the bench to examine them closely. The hearing was extremely heated, with the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Roger King, and Harrison's lawyer Moldovsky frequently clashing and accusing each other of misconduct. With Harrison himself shouting out too, deputies were forced to de-escalate the situation on multiple occasions, as Judge Latrone tried to quell the hostility between the 2 sides. Moldovsky tried to argue that murder was not consistent with Harrison's nature, and that he had been framed for the deaths of the 7 women who had either overdosed or been murdered by others in the apartment. According to Moldovsky, Harrison had only confessed because he had the mental age of a 9-year-old, and police had provided him with details that aligned with their findings to tell them. There was some debate as to whether Harrison's confession to 4 of the murders would be dismissed, as he had only confessed to them during a second round of questioning by Detective Hansen where he had not been reread his rights. However, Judge Latrone ultimately allowed the entire confession, along with the graphic crime scene photos, to all be used as evidence. As jury selection began for a trial set for March 4th, the prosecutor announced they would be seeking the death penalty. On March 8th, Harrison chose to waive his right to a jury trial, opting instead for a bench trial where the judge would make the final decision. His lawyer and mother convinced him that a jury might be swayed by the disturbing evidence, making it harder to remain objective. Given that Judge Latrone had already been exposed to much of the evidence, the trial was expected to proceed much more quickly than originally anticipated. At his trial, after presenting all of the evidence, the prosecution introduced a surprise witness called Paula. According to Paula, she had lived with Harrison, and he had regularly strangled her during sex, sometimes causing her to pass out. In the 3 years she was with him, Paula claimed that Harrison told her that he strangled Robin de Chazor to death because she was going to leave him. Paula further claimed that Harrison had admitted to practicing necrophilia with the corpse, which triggered an outburst from him, during which he accused her of lying. Fearing he would do the same to her if she left him, Paula claimed she felt trapped and unable to leave, causing her to endure sexual assault, beatings, and torture at his hands. While her testimony was intended to cement Harrison's conviction, the defense quickly jumped on her claim that Harrison had strangled Robin. While he had strangled a number of his victims, the evidence had implied that he had beaten Robin to death rather than strangled her, which cast doubt on the credibility of Paula's testimony. They also questioned if she was telling the truth at all, as there was no other evidence that Harrison had been able to maintain long-term relationships. 2 days later, Mary Hogan, the woman who had anonymously told her story to the press before, took the stand to share her experience of living with Harrison. She testified that they had sex multiple times a day, and during some of their encounters he tried to strangle her. Mary also described seeing the body of Robin de Chazor on the roof, indicating that the corpse had been there since before October 1986, much earlier than Harrison had stated in his confession. To escape with her belongings, she had to seek police help, as Harrison had threatened to kill her with a machete and locked her in the apartment. Mary claimed she did inform an officer about the body on the roof, but he didn't believe her, and never investigated it. She also described how Harrison spoke daily to his Cookie Monster puppet, before declaring that she had never loved him, and had never been pregnant as he had believed. Hearing her words, Harrison charged her, pushing past 2 deputies before he was restrained. Moldovsky later claimed his response stemmed from anger upon realizing that she had lied to him about the pregnancy, and was not an indication of him having a violent nature. Another witness, one of Harrison's drug addict associates, claimed to have witnessed him strangling 2 women, as well as having seen Mary Mathis's body on the bed in the apartment with a terrible smell. However, his testimony was dismissed when it was revealed he had been paid for his statements, and had previously been found incompetent to stand trial in his own legal case. Throughout the trial, Harrison was noted as behaving strangely. At one point, he brought 4 monkey puppets into the courtroom, playing with them while his defense argued his case. In another instance, he was seen giggling when the leg bones found in the bag on the roof were being discussed. His demeanor was even said to be bouncy and upbeat. In his closing arguments, Moldovsky proposed that either the women had overdosed, that someone else was responsible for their deaths, pointing fingers at the landlord and his relatives who had been the first people at the crime scene, or that Harrison was psychotic and high to the point that he may have accidentally strangled the women. In response, the assistant district attorney sarcastically remarked, "Toto, we're no longer in Kansas," calling the idea that anyone could accidentally strangle 7 women laughable. In his view, Harrison was a serial killer, plain and simple.
7?
By waiving his right to a jury, Harrison's fate was left solely in the hands of Judge Latrone. Unsurprisingly, Latrone found him guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse for all charges. As the verdict was read, Harrison sat up, blinked his eyes, and shook his head, before remarking, "Everything will work out just fine," and asking if they could give him his Cookie Monster puppet back as it was no longer needed as evidence. Moldovsky later told reporters, "I assume he knows he was found guilty, but I'm not sure."
That boy knows. He knows.
After hearing the verdict, Camelia de Chazor, the mother of victim Robin de Chazor, wept outside the courtroom, stating, "I guess justice was done. I still hate him." When a reporter asked her if Harrison should receive the death penalty, she coldly responded with, He deserves anything he gets. Leroy Artisan, the father of Sandra Garvin, told reporters, "I wouldn't say she's resting easy, but I would hope. This has been one of the most excruciating phases of my life, just having to go there and sitting through it. I guess time heals all things." Harrison's mother claimed that he had been wrongfully convicted, and that the landlord and his family were the true killers, and had successfully pinned it on her mentally incompetent son. In contrast, Harrison laughed and even signed autographs, claiming he wasn't concerned about the verdict. Assistant District Attorney King, while happy with the outcome of the trial, told reporters, "At this point, I can only say that the books might not be closed. There might be other victims." In May of 1988, Judge Latrone sentenced Harrison to 6 consecutive terms of 7 to 14 years, 6 death sentences, and 1 life sentence. In a surprising move, Latrone stated that Harrison would not be executed until after serving his life sentence. Moldovsky, his defense attorney, called the decision compassionate, as it meant that Harrison would effectively serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole and not be executed.
So
Latrone
he'll die
cited
in
Harrison's
prison.
severe neglect during childhood
They're not gonna kill
and his
him,
lack
he'll
of
die
prior
in
criminal
prison.
convictions as mitigating factors. The single life sentence was for the murder of Robin DeShazor, the first victim, as there were no other murders to provide aggravating circumstances. While some criticized his compassion, it was evident that Harrison had endured unimaginable hardships as a child, which may have contributed to his later psychological issues and the development of alternate personalities, if his claims are to be believed. This unprecedented sentence essentially eliminated Moldovsky's plan to appeal, as he didn't want to risk a decision that might worsen the situation for his client who had essentially avoided being executed. However, in 1994,
Gotta take it on the chin,
Pennsylvania
buddy.
Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the death sentence must be carried out, putting Harrison at immediate risk of execution. The execution was scheduled for December 7th, but Judge Latrone delayed it. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case, and the execution date was rescheduled for August 1996. However, further delays pushed the case into 2002 when the U.S. Supreme Court banned the execution of what it called the mentally retarded. Harrison's legal team worked to prove that he met this standard. One psychiatrist noted that although Harrison's IQ was below 70, he didn't meet the criteria because he was able to function beyond his test scores. Finally, on December 20th, 2003, 17 years after his original sentencing, Harrison was deemed incompetent to be executed. His death sentence was vacated and his life sentence was reinstated. He is now 65 years old, and after studying religion and being ordained, serves as a minister from behind bars, often referred to as Philadelphia's corpse collector, or as the Cookie Monster Killer. Harrison's case is a difficult one to fully comprehend. While there seems to be no real doubt that he was responsible for the deaths of the 7 women he was convicted of killing, whether he truly understood what he was doing or the gravity of his actions is less clear. Whatever the truth of it, Harrison's tragic upbringing and dire circumstances clearly contributed to his twisted mental state. Even if he did know and understand what he was doing was wrong, he clearly was severely mentally ill. He did, after all, spend all his time talking to a Cookie Monster puppet, whether he had multiple personalities or not. And with that, our exploration of this strange case comes to a close. I've begun calling the serial killer trio of Harrison, Heidnik, and the Frankfurt slasher the Philly Three as I've been researching them. I still find it difficult to comprehend that these 3 distinct serial killers were hunting and murdering in each other's backyards at the exact same time, while I don't personally believe their actions had any connection to one another, beyond perhaps the economic and societal situation at the time creating an environment ripe for people like them to abuse. I actually find the notion that they were acting independently more chilling. Somebody pointed out to me on the Frankfurt slasher video that it feels more like something from the world of Dexter, and I'm inclined to agree. It always feels far-fetched in stories like Dexter that there are so many serial killers active in the same city at the same time, but these cases make it frighteningly clear that it's entirely possible. Given, I imagine, many of the
All right, y'all jump in the comments. Let me know what you guys think. And that is a good question he brought up. Do you think, we know they all 3 of those cases are separate. It was acting, in their own way or on separate terms. But do you think they knew each other? Do you think they had like a killing club or something? But jump in the comments. Let me